Welcome back to Art Appreciation. We are studying today the visual elements of art. This is chapter 4. This is kind of a two-part chapter or topic where we have the visual elements that we'll study today, and then we'll do another one on a similar idea called the principles of design for next time. So these two kind of go together. They're related. But for now, the visual elements. So you can see a list there in blue, and I'll just read them for the first time. Line, shape and mass, light, color, texture, and pattern, space, time, and motion. Now, this is switching gears just a bit from what we have been studying. The first 3 chapters were really big concepts, as I've said before, of how to think about art, or just really diving into some deeper questions of why do artists do what they do? What is art? How is it so uniquely human that it's been done always by humans? And this is more, this chapter, this unit is more about analyzing what we see when we look at a work of art. And we're going to look at just many, many different types, styles, time periods of art as we go through these elements. But you'll see that you can use these visual elements to describe and talk about what you're seeing. So that's really one of our big goals in art appreciation. One of the objectives, really, of the course is that you can look at works of art and describe what you see and talk about it with the vocabulary of art that artists use. So I always describe these as tools that artists use to make something. Just like if you were building a house, you would need tools, a hammer and screwdrivers and all kinds of tools to make the house, right? To build something. Or if you were a woodworker and you're making something out of wood, you may need simple tools or you might need more complex tools. But tools are needed to do anything. And so without at least one of these tools, you can't make art. You need to be able to at least have one, but many times artists use multiple tools to make works of art. So you may have to use both color and light and space as you're creating a work of art. And we'll dive into that more about how each of these are used and how they overlap oftentimes. I like to think of it, they're called the visual elements. And you know what the word elements means. I think of things like, even in science, the elements that are known to man that have been discovered that we put on the periodic table of the elements. Those are the basic building blocks, the things that the earth is made of, right? The things that scientists through hundreds of years have discovered that's the basic core parts of what the earth's crust is made of. And it's kind of like that with art. When we look at a work of art, we're wanting to break it down and really dissect visually what we're seeing so we can find what it's made out of and then describe how that element is being used. So I'm going to click to the next slide, which is just a little bit of a summary of what I just said there with the visual elements. They help us analyze our visual experiences. These 7 terms are also used as the fundamental language for the discussion about works of art. That's really a summary of what I've been saying. I want you to, as we go through these, really chapter 4 and chapter 5, as we talk about these visual elements and then the principles of design next time, very important that you understand what they are broadly, but then the individual ones. In your notes, you'll want to make like a clear distinction as to the element we're talking about. For instance, the first one we're going to do is line. So you want to make a clear place in your notes for line, and then clearly represent, clearly having your notes what work of art we talked about, and then there will be vocabulary within that, most likely as well. Under the big element of line, there are several words that we have to come up with a definition and discuss underneath that heading of line. So I'm just trying to help you see how to outline your notes a little bit. You will need some space under each element, in other words, to create effective notes that will have all the vocabulary that we talk about. So our first one is line. You can see a YouTube address on the screen there. I'm going to actually click over and show you a very brief video for each of the elements just to kind of introduce them. They're only about 3-minute videos, but I'm just going to click over as I go through the lecture today. We talk about 7 elements, and there'll be a quick video for each one of the 7. The videos are good because they show you many, many, many works of art where they selected those works of art to show in the video of good examples of how the artist is using line. And then when we get to space or color or texture, same thing. They're going to show you works of art that are really good examples of the artist using that particular element. And so I just want you to visually absorb that. Like, think about it, look at it as you watch the videos. Don't just check out because you want to glean from that to get the gist of what are artists doing with line in their artwork. One other side note before I go to that slide or that video about line in particular, the first of the visual elements, I do want to make one note. You know, when we were learning in chapter 3 about the themes of art, and I told you those are generalized themes. Those are themes that this particular textbook that we use came up with as a way to mentally categorize what we see when we look at works of art. And theme, again, is what they're about, what the work is about. That would be like more like the content, like what is the artist trying to do with this work of art. And those themes can change from art expert to art expert. There's not a set list of themes. And I mentioned that when we were talking about themes. In this topic of the visual elements, these are very set visual elements. A couple of them will vary from book to book or teacher to teacher in the art world, but basically the visual elements, especially line, color, texture, form, shape, those basic ones, those are always the same. No art teacher or book would change those. Time and motion is a new one that is going to be not considered an element of art by every art instructor. But what I'm trying to say is these are tried and true, taught forever, the visual elements. Even from in public schools, art teachers try to teach young kids about these. Because actually, even as a 5-year-old, you can identify color and how it's being used in a work of art. You can identify shape and how it's being used. And so they try to teach these even to young students so that you have a good idea about how to look and discuss art. So all the way from elementary school to college, the visual elements are just always taught. It's fundamental, like this says in the definition. It's the fundamental language for the discussion. Okay, so I'm going to click over to our first one, which is line.
How did everyone suddenly get so good at writing? WordTune. It's your writing wingman.
Each of these pictures is a self-portrait by a well-known artist. Although they are portraying very similar things, one main idea that differentiates them is how the artists have used line in their work. Line is one of the 7 elements of art, along with shape, color, texture, form, value, and space. These 7 elements are the building blocks of all art and are a great place to start when analyzing or interpreting works of art. Line is the path created when an object moves from one point to another. In the visual arts, lines are made when you draw or paint marks on a paper, canvas, or when materials such as wood, glass, and metal are bent or shaped. Lines are also made by photographers and filmmakers when they choose how to angle their cameras and how to compose their shots. Lines can be horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, straight, curved, or free form. They can be thick or thin, light or dark. Sometimes one line can be all of those things. Lines can be described in many ways: dashed, dotted, rough, smooth, zigzag, implied. What qualities do you see in these lines? How would you describe them? Every artist has a unique way of making lines. It's one way of expressing their individual style. This is a self-portrait by Jean-Michel Basquiat. His lines might be described as bold, jagged, almost messy at times. What do these lines make you think of? Why might he have chosen to represent himself in this way? Compare that to the faint, seemingly unfinished quality of this self-portrait by David Hockney. What do his lines suggest to you? Do they make you think or feel differently than the Basquiat self-portrait? If you were drawing a self-portrait, what kinds of lines would you choose to represent yourself? What kinds of lines would communicate the messages you want viewers to think about? The next time you are looking at a sculpture, painting, or drawing, try to notice what kinds of lines are used and interpret what they mean to you.
Okay, so hopefully that visually helped you a little bit. Oops. Here, hold on a second. There we go. Hopefully that was an added bonus to visually seeing examples of line. And I hope you caught on that it can be, line is in all forms of works of art, not just drawings with pencil on paper. It is sculpture, painting, it is photography, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about that, so hopefully it'll help you see some variety that way. So this first, oops, I need to go back to this slide. Number 1, line. Make sure you have a nice clear place in your notes explaining what line is. What is it exactly? It's defined as the path of a moving point. If you were paying attention in that one little short video within the video, I think they have a Picasso drawing how he uses line to very simply draw a self-portrait or a portrait of someone. And it's basically, you put your pencil down and you make a mark and it's boom, it's a line. And so that's very simply and basically what the definition of line is. However, it's much more complicated than that. We all know, right? It's very in us to make lines, whether it's drawing in sand when you're at the beach with your finger in the sand, or like I said, how it's so innate in our human nature, and as children, how we draw lines into dirt on a car or steam on a glass. That's line right there. You're using your finger or a stick to make a mark. Okay, so there are two basic types of outlines. Well, there's actually more than two. I shouldn't say two. But the first two are outline and contour lines. So we'll kind of discuss those together. An outline defines a two-dimensional shape. So this is just very, very simple, what you might think of as an outline. For instance, just this shape here. That will be like a circle, right? It's the outline, the yellow outline is just defining that circle. That's all it's doing. So that's what we would call an outline when you're outlining something. A little more complicated is this concept of contour lines. Contour lines record boundaries and often define more specifically what shapes or forms are represent. They don't just outline something, they help us know what it is, and even more than that, like the depth of the thing. So it starts to show how it might take up space, or boundaries between one object and the next. For instance, if you're drawing a landscape and you draw a tree, okay, you're drawing the edges of the tree, you're drawing the boundary between the tree and the rest of the grass and sky or whatever's around the tree. So you're creating a boundary. And then you may draw some lines inside that shape of the tree to help show how it takes up space, or how it's got some fatness to it, or maybe some of the details more on the tree. So those are more like contour lines. So I guess in your mind, just think of outline as very simplified, defining a two-dimensional shape. And really emphasize that in your notes. It's a two-dimensional shape. It's flat. So again, it's this. You know, that's defining that shape, but we don't see any fatness to that. Where a contour line is, yes, recording boundaries, defining the shape, yes. But it's also helping to represent the form. And when we talk about form, which we'll get to eventually, shape and form is another element of art, that is three-dimensional. So in your mind, you could probably, or even in your notes, you could probably help yourself identify the difference between outline and contour line by one is two-dimensional and contour specifically typically more three-dimensional. So let me show you this example. I'll let you get those notes down. In fact, I'm going to even put 3D. Contour lines can record two-dimensional, 2D, but they're usually thought of more when you're creating the three-dimensional effect of a drawing. So here's the example I'd like to show you for contour lines. It's a study of a rearing horse, and if you look at it, you might think, wow, that looks very three-dimensional. That looks like it's really taking up space. I can tell it's like the rear end of the horse is closest to us, the head is furthest away, it looks like it's going up in the air. That's because it's well drawn using contour lines. It's not because there's shading or value. There is a little bit of shading and value in here, like blurring. But it's not really because there's no color. There's not a lot of texture. Basically, what you're seeing here are just lines. And so this, let me just outline here, this would be like an edge, right, between the horse and the rest of the space around it. We don't really see much here in the background, but that creates a boundary between the object we're drawing and the background, and so that's considered like a contour line. But another thing contour lines do is they create the form. They create the three-dimensional feeling. So like here where they're showing that hip muscle on the horse, that is how we can really tell how this horse takes up space. how it's got some thickness to it. This is it's inside the actual shape of the horse. Do you see that? If I was just doing the outline of it, it might look more like this. This would be the outline of the horse, right? Let me go up here. That would be more like the outline. Although even in that outline, the way the artist has rendered this, it feels more three-dimensional. But then when we start thinking about getting those contour lines in here, these are more like the contour lines. Some of these that define the form even more. So, again, to simplify it in your mind, remember that an outline is really just a basic, simple outline, if it's a shape. And so we could talk about outlining this horse, but really the way the artist has drawn this, even the complexity of showing how it takes up space, is we would call this a contour line drawing. And certainly the way the artist has put some of these inside lines and details, they are trying to show, they have skillfully drawn the horse in a way that shows it is three-dimensional. It is a horse taking up space. And so that is really the defining thing with the contour line. Okay, so what else do lines do? Lines can create direction and movement in a work of art. We're going to talk about three types of lines: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. And artists use these types of lines all the time in art to direct our eyes, to move us around in a work of art. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes they just do it without even realizing they're doing it because they're just skillful. Artists just have a sense of how to do that in their work of art. So vertical lines, these three types of lines, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal, actually do create different feelings or moods based on when they're applied to a work of art. Vertical seem assertive, denote growth and strength. Horizontal appear calm. Diagonal lines are the most dramatic and imply action. So, if you'll recall, a good example to think about is the Maya Lin Vietnam War memorial. And if you recall, the photograph we looked at didn't show it from this angle, but basically what you have is this very badly drawn drawing. I'm using a mouse, so it's not very effective. You basically have that shape sticking out of the ground. So you have a strong horizontal here, and then you have the war memorial coming out of the ground. This is made out of granite, going uphill to the vertex and then back downhill. And at the corner, it bends, it turns right here, if you recall that image. I'm going to click to another picture so you can look at it from a different point of view. So this is the Maya Lin Vietnam War Memorial from one view. This is not the one I showed you earlier in chapter, well, I believe it was just chapter 3. But what we're seeing here is one view from like the vertex of the memorial and looking out towards the Washington Monument at the end. So just to jog your memory. What you do when you enter this, the way she designed it is right here, you would enter here, walk along this sidewalk looking at the memorial, and as you come this way, the height of the wall is getting taller and taller and taller. So that at the beginning, it's just at your feet. But by the time you get to here, it's actually above your head. Do you remember us talking about that? So that is she's using line in a very powerful way. Now, this is three-dimensional. This is a sculpture in space, so it's a little different way of thinking about line, because you really have to think about these edges. When we say, look how she used line, we're really talking about these edges of things, right? Or even the edge of the sidewalk that I drew. And even this line right here, the edge, the boundary between the flat wall, the sidewalk that comes out flat that we walk on, to this strong vertical going up. Okay? So those are all lines we could talk about with Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial. And then when you get to the vertex where the thing meets at the corner that we can't see, it's over this way, there would be a very strong vertical, because that's where the two flat granite angled walls meet at the corner, right? And they make a right angle corner. So think about that really strong vertical corner right there. That is a use of a vertical line that's really strong. I'm going to click back to the other slide now and tell you. Vertical lines seem assertive or denote growth and strength. So it just makes sense that she would use that vertical right at the vertex of the two lines, the two granite walls coming together. Horizontal lines, as I said, appear calm. So think about how she used horizontal lines in that work. The sidewalk you walk on, the edge between the granite and the ground, those are very flat horizontal. And this is a somber, solemn memorial where everyone always says that I've not seen it, but people that have seen it say it's always very calm. People are very reflective, respectfully quiet, and that just kind of helps to create that mood. However, then the diagonal lines, and she definitely uses diagonal lines, going uphill towards the corner from ground level to the highest point. That's a diagonal line. It's going uphill. And they create more of a dramatic feel and imply action. And she was absolutely trying to do that as she designed this. She wanted us to feel that we were going into a war. It's going uphill as you walk in, and it's getting more intense. It started as a war that was very small and thought it would be not a big deal, be won easily, and it just kept increasing and increasing and increasing. And then at the vertex, she says you turn the angle and you go back downhill, and we exited the war. So that's really, really, definitely how she was using that diagonal to create that. Now, did she even know she was doing that? She probably did think about it some, but who knows? Artists do this stuff intuitively a lot. They just know that that's going to be the effect. And so they don't even have to think about it quite as much as we do sometimes, but definitely intentional. And then one other note is, isn't the Washington Monument so tall and vertical? Look at that vertical line right there. And that is definitely creating that sense of strength and very solid and strong, assertive. So this is just a good example of showing all the different types of ways lines can create that feeling. Now, to dive in a little deeper, we're going to look at a work of art. This one by Thomas Eakins. This is a painting. I like to push your brains to to see these elements used in different art mediums. We talked about a three-dimensional outdoor memorial. Well, this is a dramatic difference. It's a flat painting, right? But same exact thing, and you can see down here in the corner how that's been illustrated. I need to open this up. It's not letting me open it up. Okay. So if you look at this painting, and I said, okay, discuss how line is being used in this work of art. I hope your eyes already will start to go to, where do you see edges? Where do you see edges of things? It's not always just that there's a line drawn somewhere. You're going to see edges. And so, could we find some vertical edges in this one? Can you find some vertical? There are some vertical, a few. Like right here, there's like a windsock back here, I think. The edges of the buildings. So there's a little bit of vertical. I think there's it's a contest and there's people standing on the shore. But these are definitely not the focus, right? There's more, that's in the background, it's kind of fuzzy. We're focused on what's here in the foreground, what's right in front of us. And so, while there are some vertical lines, our eyes definitely go more towards the horizontal lines. We have a real strong one here, the boat sitting on the water. Just the lines of the boats, many of the lines on the boats are horizontal. You have a real strong horizontal here where the water meets the land. You have another horizontal here. Then you have this, which is bumpy and irregular. And it has a little bit of verticalness and diagonal mini lines happening within it. But if you look at the overall feel of it, it's still kind of just going across. So we would even think of this one as a bumpy, irregular, maybe more active, but still in general it's horizontal. The rooftops over here are horizontal. And then what do we have here? Not very many pink lines, right? Just a few. Many horizontal lines. And then lastly, what do we have for diagonal? Do you see diagonal lines? You can use this as a cheat sheet. You have the oar of the guys are paddling with, strong diagonal. You have the angle of their arms, the angle of their backs. We also have just little cloud lines up here. You can't see that one comes out of your screen, but kind of like little diagonal dashes up in the sky that creates a diagonal. Really, within this horizontal, you kind of do have a diagonal right there on the tree line. And so what do diagonal lines do? They denote movement, tension, and so that's what an action. Do you see that that's where the action is, right? Definitely. So you kind of have this calm scene, and then you have action happening right here. And just very few, definitely not strong, vertical lines. So that's how we could assess the line in a work of art. You might be thinking, I also see, I hope you're thinking this, little lines in the water. Do you see all those? The reflections make little horizontal lines all throughout. So there's like a lot of horizontal through here that's pushing that that relaxed, calm, still mood. And then we have this tension here. Later we'll talk about how you can find the point of emphasis or where the artist wants your attention to go. And this will be a good example of that. Do you see how because the lines are different there, because that's where the action is, your eyes go to that place. So that will be what we will later call emphasis, or emphasizing a certain area. Okay, one more aspect of line. Line's kind of a big one. There's several aspects we have to talk about. So the last part of this for line is implied line. Implied lines can be dotted lines. They can be directional cues, such as a finger pointing in a specific direction, and that creates a line of sight. And those are examples of implied line in action. So artists do this definitely to emphasize what they want the viewer to look at. Remember when we talked about, in the first chapter, we talked about artist and audience. Sometimes the artist is really, definitely, often, a lot of times, trying to do something with their audience. They're trying to get their audience to think or feel something, or in this case, look somewhere. or see a dotted line but make the connection of what the thing is or what it's referencing. Think about when you go outside or just see a person standing still with their head kind of turned up, and they're obviously staring at something. Maybe staring up at the sky or just staring at something. What do? We look at the same thing. We stare at the same thing. We're like, what are they looking at? That's the idea of this. It's like controlling the person to look at what you want them to look at. So this is a work of art we can use to talk about this idea of implied line. The computer's lagging just a little bit. You see, there's a lot going on here. This is linear analysis. Oh, this is actually the title of this is The Embarkation for Cythera. And so content is not really important right now. We won't go into detail about what this is about, but we're analyzing the use of line in it. And there's several things happening here. Our eye kind of starts here in the foreground. We see this is the closest thing to us of people you could think of. So it's sort of like your eye starts here, and then look how the people have been arranged in this sort of continual line. And your eye gets pulled back here, and then you go up into these angels up in the sky, and you kind of loop around and go all the way back here to this thing. So this is an intentional use of actually using people, almost like a dotted line that goes back in space. And we're carried up and over and through. There's other things happening in here to show line. For instance, this statue right here, look at how she's pointing. See her finger pointing? So our eyes go down and we're like, what's going on right there? What is happening in this place? In fact, that brings us back down to this area, and then we get back on this one, and our eyes go around like this. Even the tree here is kind of swooping around like that. That's intentional use of line to point in a direction. But these angels back here kind of dotted and dashed, but they go in a line, don't they? And so our eye just follows that around naturally. The way this hill curves kind of keeps us on track too. It's like, whoop, where are we going? And we go back into that cycle around. So you can see how everything is kind of pointing this direction. What is that, in case you're wondering? It's guiding our eyes towards this, what is called the island of love. And so it's hard to tell. Are they coming to it or are they leaving it? They look like they're going both directions, right? These people look like they're heading towards it, but it's just apparently this wonderful place. And so that's where the artist definitely is trying to lead your eye to. And so we would call that implied. There's no arrows. There's no just solid line like I drew on the screen. There's no line like that actually doing it. He uses people pointing, body position to guide us in that direction. Shape of the tree, branches. Okay, so line, summary, creates boundaries. It shows direction and motion, like we just talked about. It can create shadows and highlights, and just keep that in the back of your mind, because we will look at that one when we get to value, one of the other elements of art. So just hold on to that one. Haven't seen an example of that yet. It also can show spatial depth on a flat surface. And we didn't get into perspective. I think we will get into that when we talk about space, but lines can be used to make things look like they're going back in space, and we'll talk more about that later too. Okay, our next element of art is going to be shape. Now, this particular lecture combines shape and mass together, like they're one thing, but really shape and mass can be separated as well. Shape is a flat, two-dimensional drawing, and mass is something that takes up space. So I will go ahead and show you both videos on the first one on shape and the second one on mass, which, slight variation again, some books, some art teachers use the word form instead of mass. So that's one of those things you just kind of have to get your mind used to. Either one means the same thing, a three-dimensional form, a three-dimensional mass. So in this video, first it'll be a 3-minute video on shape, and the second will be a 3-minute video on form, which are slides called mass. So just know that's an interchangeable word that way. Let me move it. And here's shape.
When the sawdust settles and the engine finally roars, the thing you care about most is a job well done.
Fruit has played a prominent role in the history of art. It's long been a favorite subject for artists, making still life paintings and drawings. Looking at still lifes of fruit is a useful way of studying how artists approach making shapes. Shape is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, form, texture, value, space, and color. When the beginning of a line connects with its own end or intersects with another, a shape is formed. In visual art, shapes are flat and are defined by their length and width. In other words, they're two-dimensional. There is an infinite number of shapes, but all fall into one of 2 categories: geometric or organic. Geometric shapes are commonly recognized, such as squares, hexagons, rectangles, and circles. Organic shapes are free-form and often one of a kind. Artists learn how to see the world around them as basic shapes. Simplifying objects into geometric and organic shapes makes drawing them easier. Shapes inherit the qualities of the lines that were used to construct them. For instance, this painting by Cezanne has heavy, solid outlines that define the shapes, whereas the fruit in this ink drawing by Manola Rocchi is made up of very soft, fuzzy lines. Each approach to making lines produces different feelings and associations in the viewers. Some artists make oranges that are perfectly round, while others draw or paint every little bump and detail of the skin. The next time you're looking at a painting or drawing, try to notice how the artist is using shape in their work. If you were making a drawing or painting, how would you interpret the objects in front of you? Would you draw them as faithfully as possible? Or would you choose to represent them more abstractly? Practice for yourself by setting up a bowl of fruit and drawing what you see.
Okay, so studying shape. Next, we're going to talk about the two at the same time. I'll just talk about some definitions here of shape, and then I'll go ahead and show you the video on mass, or form as they call it. Shape and mass can be created by line, texture, and color changes. Shape is two-dimensional form that occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. Shape is a two-dimensional form that occupies an area with identifiable boundaries. So do you see how line and shape kind of mix together? We just said that an outline defines the edges of a two-dimensional shape, right? You have to use both of them in that sentence. And then we talked about contour lines, like we're going to see here with mass or form. Mass or form is a three-dimensional form that occupies a volume of space with identifiable boundaries. So they both, shape and mass, have identifiable boundaries, right? One is defining a flat shape, though, a flat object, and the other is defining volume of space. I'm going to add in here, since your video describes it as form. And I often do too. I was trained to learn the term form when talking about this element of art, but this particular book uses mass, which is a perfectly fine thing too. And mass, if you know it from science and math, mass is occupying three-dimensional space, right? That's what the mass of something is, how much space it takes up, the volume. So that kind of correlates with what you might learn in other subjects as well. I'm going to go ahead and play the other video.
I love knowing what melts you. 3200s, 127,000, 4.
Examples of the genre of art called trompe-l'oeil. Translated from French, trompe-l'oeil literally means fools the eye. It's a style of art that makes you question if what you're seeing is real. It's this illusion of depth that artists create, which tricks our eyes. When shapes get this third dimension of depth, they become forms. Form is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, shape, texture, value, space, and color. When given form, circles become spheres, squares become cubes, triangles become cones or pyramids. Form takes up space in either a real or implied way. In paintings and drawings, for instance, form is implied because it's an illusion of 3 dimensions. With sculpture, on the other hand, form is real because it takes up 3-dimensional space. Visual artists use light and shadow effects to create the illusion of 3-dimensional form. A strong sense of form can also be created by increasing contrast between highlights and shadow areas. Street artist Banksy uses this technique a lot. Notice how these human forms are made up of only white, black, and 1 shade of gray. Sometimes form can even be created by an artist's use of color. Artist Akash Nihalani often juxtaposes brightly colored forms against neutral backgrounds to create the illusion of depth. Notice his forms don't incorporate any shading at all. These are just a few ways artists create forms and incorporate depth into their work. What are some other ways that artists create form? Is there a particular style or technique that draws you in and catches your eye? Mastering many different approaches to making form will give you unlimited options when creating your own artwork, and will enable you to fool viewers' eyes in any way you choose.
That was a great video because it shows so many examples of how form is just really fascinating to look at, and how artists with lots of skill can really use that concept to, like he said, to the point of trompe-l'oeil, where it's tricking your eye. So those are fun to look at. But I think I always say one thing to help you remember the difference between these two is shapes are flat and forms are fat. They're taking up space. They're creating that illusion of space. Now, I wanted you to make one, he said it in the video, and a good thing to remember is when you're dealing with two-dimensional works of art, when you're dealing with painting or drawing, so that the art is being done on a flat surface, and you are creating the effect of mass or form, you are making an illusion. You are using artistic skill to somehow create that illusion that it's a three-dimensional object that the person is looking at. Where shape, or excuse me, I meant to say, where in a sculpture or other type of work like that, the form, the mass is real. Like that one of the balloon sculpture, the balloon dog sculpture, it actually does take up space. So there's actual form, and then there is implied form. So just kind of a side note about that. Okay, so an example to look at for these two is the first one is the raven and the first men. And as you can see, this is a photograph of a sculpture. And so you can see that is three-dimensional, that is a form. And then the other one, Gustavus Hamilton, is a painting on a two-dimensional surface, but they are creating form through light and shadow, through color, all different types of artistic skill to create the illusion that it's three-dimensional. Look at his face. Do you see the shadow on the side of his face? That is to help create the illusion that he's a three-dimensional man, that he has a head that's round and it goes back in space on that side of it. So, and then down in the cloth down here, you can see the shadows and highlights. That creates this bumpy effect, like it's got form, like it's three-dimensional. Same idea, shape and mass. There's two broad categories of shape and masses. They can be geometric or organic. So these are a couple of vocabulary words that you'll want to learn. I usually teach these two more specifically under the category of shape, but there can be masses as well. So think of it this way. Geometric sounds like it has geometry in it, right? And so geometric forms or shapes can be mathematically defined. They're things like circles, cones, cubes, diamonds. And I inserted some images here of geometric shapes. They're basically the ones that we can name. So these are shapes. Geometric forms would be like a cube. So it still takes up, it's three-dimensional, it's taking up space, but we still have a name for it. It's very geometric. I'm going to insert here, geometric shapes and forms. And I'm going to do it here too, because when we're doing this, we're kind of lumping these two elements together of shape and mass. So I'm going to say geometric and organic shapes and forms. So hopefully that makes sense. I always just say to remember which is the difference. Geometric are man-made. They're the man-made shapes and forms. Circles, cones, cubes, diamonds, and they have a name. And they sound mathematical. Organic shapes and forms are irregular and suggest forms and shapes found in nature. So you can see the example here. The shape of a cloud, the shape of a tree, the shape of a water droplet. Those are all irregular, or a puddle of water. If I said draw the shape of that puddle of water, it's not going to be a perfect circle. It's going to be an irregular shape because you're looking at nature, and things in nature are usually these organic, not perfectly shaped forms and shapes. I'm using the word shape a lot. So I hope you can see that. Even in the bottom there, think man-made is geometric think organic is God. He creates things that are organic. And we also call those free form. They're just like irregular. So that's a big distinction to make in your mind. So make sure you get both of those definitions down and understand them. Continuing with shape and mass, we have figure and ground. Here's a couple of other definitions. Vocab words. The figure and the ground are how we perceive shapes and masses within a work of art. The figure is the positive shape on which visual focus is placed. So I always say just the thing that the artist was trying to draw, not the background. The ground, on the other hand, is the negative shape. We call it negative, or area sometimes considered the background in a work of art. Now, any work of art you can look at and determine what is the positive space and what is the negative space. And we talk about this when we talk about space as well, when we talk about the element of space. But, like, for instance, I'm going to click back real quick to a previous image. This one, which was when we were talking about line, study of a rearing horse, you can very clearly see the horse is the positive space, right? This positive shape. The area all around it, the kind of basically blank paper and a few squiggly lines in the background. I think this is a horse down here too. That will be considered the negative shape. Okay? So you can see when you draw an edge to something, you are creating a distinction between the negative shape and the positive shape. And we can use that knowledge whether we're talking about shapes or masses, whether we're talking about two-dimensional or three-dimensional things. There's going to be the positive and the negative. And we call that figure ground. So on this particular work of art, black on white picture, just think about the name of that. Black on white picture. You have a white picture with black lines or black design, black shapes. But your eyes could perceive that as, am I looking at a white picture with black marks, or was it a black picture with white marks? And your eyes can kind of go back and forth on that, determining between, listen to my vernacular here, the positive shape and the negative shape. You can go back and forth between those. So some works of art almost have like a balance between the positive and the negative, and they kind of are playing with your eyes that way. And one more reference back to what we just looked at. Again, this is the raven in the first Men. That's a three-dimensional sculpture. But you can talk about the positive and the negative. Clearly, the sculpture itself is the positive, right? But look at the negative shapes underneath his wing, underneath his beak there's a little negative right here. So you can actually talk about the negative shapes that you can see. So if you were drawing this three-dimensional object, you would, if I was saying, okay, draw this picture, part of drawing the positive is looking at the negative and looking at that shape and drawing that well. In fact, in drawing classes, that is a common exercise that I've had students do. If you can draw the negative, you're actually drawing the positive. And even out here, if you look at this edge and you're drawing and looking like, what does this space look like right here? What's that shape? Right here. Look at the negative. Don't just draw the positive. You're actually drawing the negative too when you draw that edge between the two. Hopefully that makes sense. But obviously with the two-dimensional work, you are creating a boundary between the positive and the negative. And so you want to look at the negative as you're drawing the positive. That's one key to being a good artist. A skillful drawer is to look at the negative as you're drawing the positive. Okay. Along the lines of shape and mass, we also have implied shapes, just like we had implied lines. Implied means to suggest something without actually drawing it straight forward. So artists use implied shapes to help unify their compositions. These are just little tricks that they do to make a work of art feel a certain way. Implied shapes can help to create a sense of order in a work of art. So here's the example of that. This is what we would call an implied triangular composition, which is a very common composition style from, this is Raphael, so the Renaissance time period, the Italian Renaissance. And I have to draw on this one as well because it's just so clearly using that triangular composition. Now, is there an edge drawn? Is there a line? Did someone actually do this? No, but you can definitely see this is the positive, right? All of this stuff in the middle here is the positive. This is all the negative shape. Yes, you can look within the negative and find more shapes. There's the shape of the tree, the shape of the rock, the shape of the mountain, the shape of the clouds. But clearly when you look at this, we can decide, oh, I see this painting is about Madonna and baby Jesus, and I don't know who he's playing with. It might be John the Baptist or something. But we can clearly see that that's what this painting is about. That is the positive. This all characterizes as the negative, or I should be using the term ground. Figure, ground. Figure, ground. And yes, you can find details within the ground, but that is still background. That is still de-emphasized and setting back. And this particular composition, and just to, if you're kind of not clear on what the word composition means, that means how the artist has arranged things on the piece of paper, how they have chosen to arrange things and put it down, how it takes up the space of the piece of paper. Think of it like that. And so this artist, Raphael, very famous artist, has decided to center it. Mary is centered. He's arranged the figures in a way that creates that sort of composition like I drew a line for. And it's known, an implied triangular composition is known to feel very stable, very secure, very kind of like a good feeling you get when you look at it, because it just feels like it's sitting strongly on its foundation. Because you have this wider base and it's all just very nice and balanced. Okay, our next one is light and value. So I'm going to click over to the YouTube video on value.
The word photograph comes from two Greek words that translate to light drawing. Some people describe photography then as drawing with light. Light defines objects and literally enables us to see things. Artists create the illusion of light by being able to produce a wide range of tonal and color values. Value is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, shape, form, texture, color, and space. Value is how light or dark a given color or hue is. Values can be better understood when they are visualized as a scale or a gradient. Here's the value scale for this gray tone. It ranges from pure white to absolute black, with a number of gray tones in between. Any hue or tone has a similar scale from dark to light. Different values are created by lightening the hue, in this case adding white to it, or by darkening it with black. When an artwork has many tones in between black and white, it is considered low contrast. For instance, in this photograph by Nicholas Nixon, notice how many different shades of gray there are. A high contrast image, on the other hand, would have very few tonal values between black and white, like this photograph by Kenneth Josephson. The texture of an object's surface can play a role in how we see value. In this photograph by Brett Weston, notice how the veins in the leaves of lettuce create areas of dramatic contrast between light and dark. Compare that with this photograph of bananas, also by Weston. The skin of the bananas dulls the light, which gives the photograph much less contrast. The different ways artists create lines and implied textures can also affect how we perceive value. Notice how heavy and dark the blacks are in this charcoal drawing. Also notice how certain areas smoothly transition from dark to light. This watercolor painting's blacks aren't nearly as dark. Notice too how the shading isn't as smoothly blended. The next time you are looking at a photograph, painting, or drawing, try to notice how the artist is rendering value. And when you're creating your own artwork, practice creating value scales with a variety of different mediums and hues, so your artwork shines in its own unique way.
You do that every time. Okay, so that gave us lots of visuals for how to use light to create value. The fundamental purpose of light is to show us the material world. It helps us understand forms and spatial relationships. Kind of interesting if you think about the scripture where God created light. He created a light and a darkness. And so without light, you can't see anything. If you think of yourself in a totally black cave where it's just absolutely no light whatsoever, you cannot see your hand right in front of your face. And there are caves like that where you get down underground and you can't see anything at all. And then just one light shines. That light coming from the light source, bouncing off of the objects in the room, including yourself, in your hand, that is what enables you to see things. And so artists are using that knowledge and that fact of physics to create the illusion of things looking three-dimensional. So you can see how light and value correlate with shape and mass. When you have a flat shape, it doesn't look three-dimensional, but it has no light source, it has no shadows, it has no highlights. When you add that element to it, when you shine a light on something and you render that in a way that shows the shadows and a lighted side, then boom, you have mass. You've created a form. So you can see how much these elements blend together and overlap. So light can also be implied. There are techniques that artists use to imply light in art. These techniques result in the illusion of shape and mass of objects. So make sure you get that in your notes. And if you ever see anything underlined like that, it's probably really important for the test. So how do they imply light? Now what that means is basically creating the illusion of shape and mass. Trying to make something look three-dimensional on a flat space, on a flat picture plane. The first technique is, and these are three techniques, shading and modeling. We use chiaroscuro, which is an Italian word that means light and dark, or values to create mass. So there's a lot of vocabulary in that sentence, but I think you can grasp what that's saying. We're using this technique of creating values to create mass or form, three-dimensional. Now, is it really three-dimensional? Many of those things that they just showed in that video were two-dimensional, were on a flat piece of paper. Many of them were photographs or drawings of a ball with a light shining on it, so you saw the highlight and the shadow. With all of those, when it's just a drawing or a painting or something that shows value, then it's an illusion. I always say artists are kind of like magicians. They're trying to create a believable illusion through what they draw that this flat surface is actually three-dimensional. So shading and modeling is like using a pencil to shade one side darker and leave one side lighter and create those values. Hopefully you're catching on to what value means. Value, if you want to write a side definition, oh, actually it's right here. Never mind. Value is the lightness or darkness of something. And so artists, when they're using value, are really thinking about how light or dark do I need this to be. Do you remember the image they showed in the video of the cityscape that had, and he said this is, there's many, many, many values within this photograph, from the darkest dark to the lightest light and everything in between, like that full range of values. And when you do that, the contrast is kind of low. It's like a subtle change from lights to darks everywhere. But if you were to draw that photograph, if I said, okay, draw that and create all those values with a pencil, you'd have to really look and think about, okay, well, if this one's black, this one's going to be just a little bit lighter than black, a little bit lighter. What's the lightest light in the whole picture? Is there like a pure white somewhere in the photograph that I have to make sure I leave that, the white of the paper, and then maybe just a little bit of shadowing. So it's relative. It's all comparing lightness or darknesses. And then here's the actual definition of chiaroscuro. It's Italian for light dark, and it's creating contrasts of light and shadow. When an artist is using chiaroscuro very clearly, you will see high contrast. You will see dramatic lights and darks. I'm going to add to this because I just don't like that it only says light. I want it to say value too. Value is really the more well-known term that we use for this element of art. Every time you write light, I would include value with that so that you know you're talking about light and value. They work together. It's the same thing. You can't have value unless you have a light source, right? Okay, so here's an example by Leonardo da Vinci. It's titled The Virgin and St. Anne. So this is an example. There's lots of things going on here we could talk about with the elements of art we've looked at so far. Can you see some line in here? Can you see how the artist has used line? You can see individual lines like in the hair and the foot. Really what you've got, if you look at the foot, just a little side note, in here, this is because it's unfinished. This is what the artwork or the drawing would have looked like initially, just like a sketch with lines, and then it's developed into this more very well-developed light and dark using, it looks like some sort of pen, but also using something that would create the highlights and shadows. And that might be done with paint. I'm not exactly sure what that's done with. But also here, you see the finger here? That is also not finished. So this was a never completed work by Leonardo da Vinci. But Look, even squint your eyes at it. Squint your eyes so that your eyes can't see as much detail, but your eyes will, when you squint them, clearly show you where the highlights are, the lightest lights, where the light's hitting things, and where the shadows are. So, and do you get a feel for where the light in this picture is coming from? Yeah, you can see it's coming from one side, the upper left-hand corner, shining down onto these objects, people. And it's hitting everybody in the same place on their body. The shoulder of the baby, the shoulder of the little boy, the face of Mary, the face of Saint Anne, the knee of Mary. It's hitting those places, and so Da Vinci's looking at how the light affects the form. And by looking at that and rendering it that way, it's creating the illusion that this thing takes up space. You can also talk about figure and ground. What's the figure? The people. It's clearly those are the emphasis. That's what the artist was focusing on. That will be the figure, or the positive shape, and then the ground is all the stuff around it, the negative space, the negative shaped space, I should say. So line, shape, and then by the artist using light and shadow, by using value, the artist has created a three-dimensional form, or it's created mass. Do you see that? It's not a flat shape. They've used contour lines. You can just use all the vocabulary we've learned so far. All right, another aspect, or the final aspect of light and value. Gotta put my value in there. Is implied. So far, like every element they give you, there's always implied, right? Because a lot of times in art, it's not just straightforward, like here it is, it's implied visually. So hatching is one technique that implies shadow and highlight. It's closely spaced together lines. I'm going to show you an example of all these in just a second. Cross hatching is parallel lines that intersect like a checkerboard, and stippling is dots spaced close or far apart to suggest darker or lighter areas. These are really, if you're using a pen or a marker or a pencil, what you would use to create the implied value in a work of art. And really, it's using line. Do you see that? You got line, line. And what is a dot? A dot is what you have before it becomes a line. So make sure you have those three types of implying value down. And here's our example work of art. This is by Charles White, Untitled, 1979. This is using those two techniques of hatching and cross-hatching. Make sure you know that this work of art uses hatching and cross-hatching. So, example, mostly cross-hatching. I'm going to show you where you can identify hatching. A lot of artists use hatching and cross-hatching when they're just doing a sketch of something using a pen or a pencil, but they want to show value. So like right here, do you see this area? That is where you could see some hatching. You have these lines that go parallel to one another, like that. Okay, there's a little bit of hatching here. But the funny thing about hatching is to do cross-hatching, you start with hatching. So I can't make this go very fast, but when I do art this way, I start with some hatching, like this motion, and then where I want it to be even darker, I would go back and add some cross-hatching, like that. So you and you just sort of get in a rhythm of scribbling almost this way, this way, this way, and then this way, this way, this way. And that creates, as you can see, the more hatching you do, like in this area, it gets darker and darker and darker. There's more lines, there's more marks. So definitely, I hope you can see, this is a way of using line to create value, to create light on form. And do you see right here? Right here, the artist purposefully did not put any marks on the edge of the nose, just right here, this little bit of the lip, eye, forehead. Why? Because they're showing where the light's coming from. And those are the highlights on this person's face. Those are the places where there shouldn't be any marks because the light is hitting it more dramatically. So this is what relative means. How light is this? Then I got to make it get darker here to show the under of the cheekbone. Or darker back here behind the neck. So that's how an artist would think about lights and darks as they're hatching and cross-hatching. All right, our next element of art is color, which is a big one. Color's kind of got a lot to it. So we will have several notes to record under this one. And I'll go ahead and show you the color video.
A lot of representational art attempts to portray the world realistically by mimicking three-dimensional space and attempting to faithfully render objects as we see them. However, many artists embrace a different reality. So-called color field painters of the 1950s and 60s wanted to reinforce the idea that the painted canvas is a flat, two-dimensional space. They made enormous, large-scale paintings that were often comprised of just one or two colors. Their art didn't represent the outside world or try to take you to another place. It reinforced the fact that you're looking at a painting. The bold, bright colors they used weren't meant to represent anything else. For them and the many artists they inspired, color is a beautiful and worthy subject all its own. Color is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, shape, form, texture, value, and space. When light hits an object, some of it is absorbed and some of it is reflected, depending on the materials the object is made of. The light that is reflected off of the object is what we see as an object's color. Red, yellow, and blue are called primary colors because they cannot be made from the mixing of other colors. However, the 3 primary colors can be mixed together to produce nearly every other hue imaginable. Green, orange, and violet are the 3 secondary colors. They are created by mixing 2 of the primary colors together in equal amounts. When you mix a primary color with a secondary color, you get a tertiary color, such as red-orange, blue-green. Every individual color can be altered by changing its value through tinting, shading, and toning. Tint is simply any color with white added to it. So red becomes pink, blue becomes light blue, green becomes light green, and so on. A shade then is created by adding black to any color. Adding black and white to a color produces a tone. Sometimes a work of art will be made up of the tints, shades, and tones of only one color. This is what we call a monochromatic color scheme. One way artists personalize their work is by creating their own very unique colors, tints, shades, and tones. Notice how the violet colors in this print by Anish Kapoor differ from the ones used by painter Morris Louis. Is there one that has more tinting or shading than another? What do you think is creating the difference? One common way people categorize colors is by temperature. Reds, oranges, and yellows are referred to as warm because they can be easily associated with a warm, sunny day. Blues, violets, and greens, on the other hand, are called cool because they often come to mind when thinking about overcast or rainy days. When cool and warm colors are mixed together in a painting, what is the overall mood or feeling then? Besides the weather, there are many other associations and feelings that colors can summon. Is there a color or combination of colors that triggers a specific memory or thought in you? Understanding the effects colors have on you will help you read an artwork and develop your own interpretation of it. And when making your own artwork, knowing the effect colors have will help you control the messages you hope to convey.
Okay, so he gave you lots of information there that we're going to now kind of go over very similar things. So first, when we talk about color, we need to talk about color theory. Make sure you're getting all these definitions down. In color theory, we look at the color wheel as our guide to understanding it. It's based on, what is the color wheel? It's based on the refracted colors observed by Sir Isaac Newton when light was directed through a prism. There were many misunderstandings about what light was and what white light was until Isaac Newton came upon this experiment where he refracted white light through a prism and could see the rainbow come out. So what you see here is the rainbow colors. We have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. If you just followed me as I went around the wheel there. So the primary colors, as the video said, this just takes memorization and studying this to get this through your head and into knowledge. You have yellow, red, and blue. This one, and this one. And they are known as the primary colors. You can't make those colors. You just have to have those colors. That's why they're primary. Secondary, orange, green, and violet, are made by mixing two primary colors, and they are placed directly between the two that they are made from. So yellow right here and red here, if you mix them in equal amounts, you will get a nice true orange. So orange is a secondary color. Same thing with green, same thing with violet. If you look here, they fall directly between the two primaries that were mixed to make them. And then intermediate colors, also called tertiary colors, are made by mixing a primary and a secondary together. So here you have primary. I'm going to actually draw it here. I can't help myself. I need to draw to show some reference. If it'll let me. So you have yellow, red, and blue. Those are the primaries. And then you can see you have orange halfway between yellow and red. You have green halfway between yellow and blue, and you have violet halfway between blue and red. Now, when you look at these tertiary colors, they fall between a primary and a secondary. So red mixed with violet, red the primary, violet's the secondary, you get a tertiary. And they don't have new names. They have a name that's a combination of the primary and the secondary. So this is actually called red-violet. Pretty easy to remember how you made it, right? And this one is a tertiary. It's right between, it'd be half mixed of red and orange, a primary and a secondary. And its title or name is red-orange. And so on as you go around the wheel. Yellow-orange, yellow-green, blue-green, and blue-violet. Those are all your tertiaries. And side note, they list the primary first. So it's red-violet, not violet-red. Red-violet because red is the primary of the two. pretty simple, straightforward. It's just a matter of memorizing the order that those go in. And that's our general color theory. This understanding is used when all artists are mixing paint, when they're trying to create new colors. This is just general knowledge that you think about. I always say when I first learned to paint, my parents didn't have very much money, and so they bought me my first set of paints when I was probably in junior high. And they only bought me yellow, red, and blue because they were nicer acrylic paints, and they didn't want to buy the full spectrum. So they just bought me those 3 colors, and plus they bought white and black so that I could mix and make all the different colors that there are. So I had to learn lots of mixing, which was probably good. And then, so that leads me to this concept of how you can mix colors to make things brighter or darker, which is when we talk about having white and black also. So you can see here, this is a color wheel like we talked about in the previous slide, just the same, only they have assimilated value with it. And value, as you can see, kind of correlates with it, going from the lightest, which would be like yellow, to darker until you get to the darkest down here, which would be the violet. Actually, yeah, it would be the violet. And so you have a progression of going from light to dark. So it kind of makes your mind scramble to think of those two things at once, like color correlates to value, but think about that. And then here we have value, which is showing a color going from its lightest version to its darkest version. That would be like value. Then we have intensity, where you can make it its purest form. So like here would be, I believe, looks like it's yellow-orange would be the color they selected, a tertiary color. And then they gradually added another color to it. And as you do that, it sort of muddies it up a little bit and makes it duller. So when you talk about intensity, you're going from the purest form of that color to getting duller and duller and duller as you add more. And in this case, it's also getting darker, isn't it? So you see value here too, but they're doing that by adding another color to it. This one is a color which it looks to me like they used again, yellow-orange. And it looks like they were adding that color's opposite, which we'll learn in a second what that means. When you add the color that's opposing directly across the color wheel, it also makes it get duller and darker. So I just described these 3 things up here. Hue is just the name of the color. So if you say red, you've named its hue. Just a fancy word for color. Value is the relative lightness or darkness, like I just showed you, talked about. And then intensity is the relative purity of a color. The purer the color, these on the color wheel are the purest you can get of those colors, right? They are pure, meaning they have not been mixed with anything else. As soon as you take this color, yellow-green, and add any other color of paint to it, you have taken its intensity down. You have dulled it just a little bit. Chroma and saturation are along that same line. This yellow, this blue-violet are very saturated. They are pure and they are saturated in their purest form. And the purity and the saturation and the intensity all go down as you add another color to it. I just always try to think of it as like you're muddying it up in some way. You're changing the intensity. I think when you look at this one, column C specifically, can you see how this is more intense, more saturated with pure color? And then it gets duller, less intense, less saturated as it goes down. Now, don't be confused. It is getting darker. You would describe that as darker, but the purity of the color is decreasing. There are there is additive color, which is when colors of light are mixed to produce still lighter colors. So additive color theory is very different than pigment. When you're talking about additive, you're talking about light, and the primaries, or the main ones that they have for light, are different than pigments, different than paint. So this is kind of like a side note. Underlying light here, we're talking about light and color, light. So this one, we'll talk about in a second, pigment. We're talking about light on this slide, just to make that clarified for you. So with additive color, as I said, colors of light are mixed to produce still lighter colors. And the main three for this one are red, green, and blue. And when you mix them all together, you actually get white light right here. And the secondaries, as you can see, when the red and the green light mix, you actually get yellow. When the blue and the green mix, you get cyan, and when the blue and the red mix, you get magenta. So it's a totally different color wheel, you could think of it. And don't be confused, we're not talking a lot about these. This is more stuff that's used for like stage production, and that's a whole different knowledge of color theory when you're talking about light, color of light. But pigment is more what we are talking about, and that is called subtractive color. Now this has to do with how our eyes are absorbing color. When we talked about light, additive, it's because more, this is very scientific, more of the rays of the color from the spectrum are being absorbed by your eyes. That's why it's additive. And it becomes actually, when they're all added together, you're seeing white. Where subtractive, they result, the pigments are actually, not the pigments, the colors are actually not absorbed by your eyes, they're reflected. So when you see pure red, your retina is only absorbing red. That's why you see red. All the others have been reflected out of your eyes. When you see orange, your eyes are absorbing red and yellow wave lights of the color, the white light from the white light. And all the rest of those are being reflected out. So it's kind of, it's deep science, right? And I don't expect you to fully study that or understand it perfectly, but you just want to understand the difference between additive color, and that's talking about light, and then subtractive color is talking about pigment. Let me just click back to this one just to let you, in case you didn't get all that written down. So with light, you have the additive. And just remember, they're different. They have red, green, and blue as kind of the main three. And when your eye absorbs all three fully, you're seeing white light. And then the pigment, which are splotches of paint, is subtractive because your eyes don't absorb all colors. And that's why it actually gets darker and muddier. So by the time if you mixed all three primary colors of paint, you're going to get just like kind of a dark, muddy brown because your eyes are actually absorbing all those different colors together. All right, so now we're talking about color harmonies. These are specific color combinations that artists will use. Intentionally, artists choose what colors will be put into their artworks. In that video, he showed you lots of artwork that was non-representational art from like the 1950s and 60s was a very popular genre of art. These basically just taking a few colors and putting them on the canvas and looking at how they interact together. Focusing on the flatness of the canvas. And so that was a time period when they used a lot of these color harmonies. However, all artists use a color scheme. When you're painting something or even making a sculpture, you think about what colors you're going to use. A color scheme is actually selecting two or more colors in a single composition or work of art. And here are some known, definite color schemes. Monochromatic means variations of the same color. So that's where you would use like red and different variations of red. And that's the only color you use on the entire painting. Or sculpture, or even a memorial or something. You choose the colors that are going to be in it. And if you go monochromatic, you're just picking one color and then making variations of that same color. Complementary is where you use hues or colors directly opposite on the color wheel. So you might want to write down, I'm going to click back to the color wheel real fast. You might want to write down what the three complementary color schemes are. The three main ones. So if you use yellow and you use purple in a color scheme, then that is considered complementary. And I always think of it like this. Complementary, when there's someone you meet in life that is completely opposite of you in every way, they're just polar opposite, you should still compliment them and be nice to them. Just a corny way to remember that. And then red and green are complementary colors. Orange and blue are complementary colors. And yes, you can use your tertiaries and make a complementary color scheme. When colors are opposite, they do not blend well together because they're so different. They're going to make each other pop, actually. Advertising, baseball, or sports teams use this knowledge to help emphasize things that they want their audience to notice. So like if you're advertising a Coke product, Coke's red, it would be smart to put some sort of greenish hue in the background because that's going to make it stand out. It's going to make it pop because it's so opposite of it. Sports teams, like I said, will oftentimes use complementary colors to create a wow effect of their logo or their uniforms or whatever. It's just something you commonly see. Red and green is Christmas, but I don't think that has to do with complementary. I think it's just holly and greenery. So that's complementary. I'm going to click back to the other slide now to show our third color scheme, which is analogous. Analogous would be adjacent hues on the color wheel. Make sure you're getting all these definitions down. Monochromatic is the same color, variations of that. Complementary is using only opposites on the color wheel. And analogous is using colors that are side by side or adjacent. So I'm clicking back to the color wheel now. And adjacent would be side by side. It could be like 3 colors side by side. It could even be 4 colors side by side. But the thing here to remember that's different than complementary is when they're next to each other, they do blend well. They're really closely related. Red-orange is really close to orange. So there's not going to be as much contrast in that work of art just using those 2 colors or even these 3 colors because they do relate. They're similar. So if you want your painting or image to pop and be dramatic and bold and maybe even clashing a little bit, you would use complementary, opposites. But if you want it to just be subtle and sort of you're creating water and you want the water to all just blend nicely, you'd probably stick to these analogous colors that are side by side. And it can be anywhere on the color wheel. It could be these 2, it could be these 3, it could be these 2, or these 3. It's just as long as they're adjacent, side by side. Okay, so that was analogous. And then the last type is triadic. Triadic means 3 equidistant hues on the color wheel. So spaced the same distance apart. That's what equidistant means. I can click back to the color wheel one more time. And so yellow, red, and blue would be a triadic color scheme. Tri means 3, so you're using 3 colors equidistant apart. And then yellow-green, red-orange and blue-violet would be equidistant apart. That could be a color scheme. So as long as they're three colors equal distances apart, that's triadic. When you're looking into a painting that's using one of these color schemes, it's interesting and it's done for purpose, and that can be a good experience and do what the artist wants it to do. It's kind of controlling their artwork to do what they want it to do, to make a feeling or whatever. But again, there are other color schemes you can use. Really, any selected use of 2 or more colors is a color scheme. You could just use yellow and purple and orange. And there's no specific color scheme that is, but that's what the artist chose to use. There's no technical name for that. It's just their chosen color scheme. So artwork works like that. But what if our whole world was complementary colors, or analogous colors, or monochromatic? I know I'm thankful that we have all the colors that God created in our world. And again, when we study white light and we think about how Sir Isaac Newton discovered the colors of the color wheel and what white light is made of, it's just fascinating to think that that's just God's creation. When he said, "Let there be light," he made all that. It all just came with it. And we just understand a little bit of it. So this is kind of fun and interesting. This is color optical effects. Simultaneous contrast is a fancy way of just saying what your eyes do when you've stared at a color long enough. Your eyes actually flip-flop, because your eyes, it has to do again with that absorbing of the color, and then when you look away from it, your eyes are still trying to absorb that color, but you get this after image effect. So this is kind of an interesting thing to do. Stare at the black dot on your screen. You can see that there's a green box, red box, and there's a black dot in the middle. If you do this right now, just stare at the black dot. Keep staring as I'm talking, or just stare at it. It doesn't actually take that long for your eyes to do this. Your eyes are absorbing only the red and only the green, right? But now, switch your eyes over and look at the white box and stare at it for a minute right in the middle of the white box. Just let your eyes kind of blur and stare. You'll see that there is actually a green in the center. Your eyes are seeing green in the center and reddish around the outside, because your eyes have been absorbing those other 2 colors for so long. When you pull away from it, your eyes see the opposite, the complementary. Just an interesting little side thing. But along the lines of this optical effects that our eyes do is a really fascinating technique called pointillism. So get this definition down. Pointillism is a technique of applying dots of pure color that are then mixed by our eyes to produce the illusion of color mixture. So the artist just applies dots of color, and our eyes do the mixing. So this, we will call this, what's happening, the process is optical color mixture, color that is mixed by the eyes. This is done by artists who just really kind of are obsessive about color, like they just are fascinated by what our eyes do when we absorb color in our eyes and what we see. And they use that as their way to make art. So I'm going to show you a very famous example of an artist who does this. This is Georges Seurat, and he did many paintings that were using this technique of pointillism. This painting is entirely done of dots. If you could zoom in and look at it up close, you would see that it's just little dots side by side. And when you step back, looking closely, they won't mix together. But when you step back, your eyes will mix those colors together. So even in looking at this slide, you're probably seeing some textury looking dots, but you're also seeing bands of color, areas of color that are created through this optical mixing. Right here, from your seat, you probably see that as like a purple. But if you were to zoom in very closely, you would see lots of red dots, blue dots, pink dots, white dots, several different colors that he skillfully used to create that color that your eyes mix to see. And they're just very closely together, many, many dots, all tight, close together. Some overlapping one another, but the mixing is not actually happening on the canvas. The mixing, he doesn't blend it together, he just puts dots. So it's kind of fascinating. This is a really famous painting, also by Seurat, and the title of it is A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Seurat, which is has been redone. This is one of those that you could talk about with the theme of art for art within art. People will redo this painting using different characters or making it a modern scene. They'll I've seen images where they make it completely modern, but all the people are standing in exactly the same place, doing exactly the same thing. The landscape's similar, and it's just kind of one of those that people do that a lot, copy it in different ways. It's such an iconic picture. It's really actually well known, and so that's why it's redone a lot, I think. But this painting I have seen in person at the Chicago Art Institute, and it's huge. It's actually really, really big. I don't have the dimensions, but I would say like 10 feet by 7 or something like that. So it's really a large painting, and you can just see all the dots within it when you're looking at it in real life. We would call the way these figures are drawn kind of almost cartoonish a little bit. We would call that stylized. Do you remember that definition way back? They almost fit into a style that Seurat would do for drawing people. And it's like his style, but it's also a stylized way that he makes people. They look stiff, and they look simplified a little bit. They're not real realistic. So just throwing in a couple of terms we've used before. Okay, so color has emotional effects as well. I told you color is a big one. Color affects us on such a basic level, we all have a direct emotional response to it in art. Emotional responses to color are both culturally conditioned and intensely personal. Since color can elicit different emotional responses, a work of art is interpreted differently based on cultural and personal associations with color. So that's just kind of some general information. You don't necessarily have to copy all that down, but just summarize it in your own words that color does evoke emotional responses, sometimes based on cultural associations and sometimes on personal associations. Is generally what that's saying. So I'll let you word that in your own way. So we can't really have just total universal ways to say this, because we find that there are cultural and personal associations with color. Things you've experienced in your own life that make you associate color differently, where one person may feel this way about it, another one feels a different way. So we can't really make universal comments, except we can go into what we call warm and cool colors a little bit generalized. So this one, it's a sculpture, like kind of a three-dimensional thing that's mounted on the wall in an art museum. So this is a photograph of a sculpture. And what colors do you see mostly used in this piece of art? You're probably saying red, yellow, orange. There is some black and white. Don't see any blues, don't see any purples, don't see any greens. So we would call this color scheme a warm color scheme. And because it's using warm colors, we usually associate specific feelings with warm colors. I'm going to go back to the color wheel real quick as we talk about warm and cool, because it's important to understand when you're looking at the color wheel, it actually divides right in half. Right through, you can go either this way, so that all these are considered warm, and all these are considered cool, or you could think of it right through here, where these are warm and these are cool. The reason I had said there's two ways you could split it is because yellow-green contains a warm color yellow and a cool color green. So you could even divide it like this. Red-violet, same thing. Red is warm, violet's cool. And I hope when you look at this color wheel, you can see that these that I'm going over on this side are the cool colors. Specifically violet, blue, and green. So any variation of those three colors, you're going to get a feeling that the work is primarily cool in color. Red, orange, and yellow are the main warm colors, so any variation of those colors in a work of art is primarily warm. And obviously the way to remember that is like the sun, fire. Those are actual real things that are warm. Where over here you might think of green grass in the shade, water, ice. I can't think of anything purple. Well, shadows a lot of times have a lot of violet in them, shadows. And so those are areas in our natural world that are cool. So it's really interesting that actual things correlate with warm and cool, like the actual temperature of things. I should have used that word already. We're talking about color temperature, basically, what color looks like it would feel like. And you could argue, well, we know that in a fire, the blue fire is actually the hottest. So there's a little thing that doesn't work with this thing that I'm saying. But in general, these feel cooler in temperature. These feel warmer in temperature. And you can divide the color wheel right in half. Okay, back to what we were talking about with this one. You can see that it is using primarily warm colors. And so while it might even feel warm, our eyes see those warm colors and we might actually feel some warmth coming off of it, like temperature. There's also some associations we can make, like typically artwork that uses warm colors have more of a excited feel to them, like action or anxious. Happy is oftentimes associated with warm colors. So there are some emotional things that we can generalize with warm. And then this one is an example of a cool color scheme. I have no idea why it says warm right here. Let me take that off. This is a cool color scheme where you're seeing a lot of blues and some green in there, maybe a little bit of purple, but not too much purple. Maybe there is some purplish coming through, like in here and in here, just a little. Mostly blues and greens, and those are definitely cool colors. And so, yes, you feel maybe a cooler temperature when you look at this, like you feel cooler physically, or you see temperature, but also some emotional things are generally associated with cool colors. More of a relaxed feeling, a calmer feeling, peaceful, although sometimes sad is associated with that, like an almost depressed can be more cool. So there are some generalizations we can make about warm and cool. And then this one, a famous painting by Edward Munch, The Scream. I probably have seen this one before. It's interesting because it uses a combination of warm and cool, doesn't it? You see some blues in there, and then you see some reds and fiery in the distance. more cools in here, some green, some blue, a little bit of cool in here, lots of black too. And so this kind of shows how when you use warm and cool together, you get a little bit of contrast that way. They're kind of fighting against each other just a bit. Another thing that visually happens is in a painting like this, where you have warm and cool, the warm colors will seem to come forward at us. They seem to come forward, where cooler colors typically seem to recede or look like they're setting back just a little bit. Just another side note on color. Okay, now we are ready for our final, I think it's our final element of art, which is texture. And they lump pattern in this as well, but we won't focus on pattern quite as much. We're going to focus on just the word texture. We'll just kind of let pattern come along with texture. Texture and pattern are the perceived surface qualities of a work of art. They can be actual or implied. So let me click over to the video on texture now. And we'll get some visuals of what texture looks like.
We tend to think of art as something just to look at, but a lot of artists make their work to stimulate our other senses. Sculptors, textile and fabric artists, bookmakers, ceramicists, and artists working in many other forms think a lot about how to engage viewers' sense of touch. Even when their art is not meant to be touched, artists put a lot of thought and work into creating many different textures. Texture is one of the 7 elements of art, along with line, shape, color, form, value, and space. Texture is the look or feel of a surface. Just like form, texture can be real or implied. If you were to run your hand across this sculpture by Alberto Giacometti, you would feel the hardness of the bronze metal and the roughness of the form that Giacometti created. This is called actual texture. Implied textures are only visual, they can't be felt. For instance, if you could touch the canvas of this self-portrait by Chuck Close, you wouldn't feel the varied textures of skin and hair. You would feel the smoothness of the oil paint. So these textures are implied because we can only see them. There are countless ways that artists create implied textures. How many different kinds of lines do you notice in this painting by Roy DeForest? You have the zigzag lines creating the woman's hair on the left, cross-hatching creating her skin, the blurred, smudged colors coming out of the dog's mouth and the man's mouth in the center. Those are just to name a few kinds of implied textures here. Textures can also be created through use of shapes. In this painting by Gustav Klimt, notice how he repeats shapes to create textures. You have the triangles and lines on the woman's dress on the left, the many spirals creating the tree in the center, and in the woman's dress on the right you have circles within circles, rectangles within squares, and all the scattered shapes throughout the piece create many different textures. Paintings and other typically two-dimensional art can have actual texture. Sometimes artists layer paint on the canvas so thick that it becomes three-dimensional. At that point, the paint is a sculptural element that can be manipulated and shaped. Some artists build up fabrics, textiles, jewelry, and many other objects on the canvas to create additional textures. Artists often feature the natural textures of the materials they use. or textures uniquely created and formed by hand. Whatever the approach, textures are an expressive tool artists use to reinforce their overall messages. The next time you're making a painting, drawing, collage, or sculpture, find a way to incorporate textures that say something relevant and important to you.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what texture can look like in works of art. And that one painting by Gustav Klimt was a great example of using shapes and in pattern, like we're looking at here, like the repetitive swirly things and the repetitive triangles. That does create pattern. So that's a great example of that. Okay, so texture and pattern, to repeat, are the perceived surface qualities of a work of art. They can be actual or implied. Actual texture is a tactile experience. Now, even though most artwork you shouldn't touch, some, if you touched it, you would feel the actual texture. I don't know if you noticed the furry, fuzzy teacup and saucer image that was in that video. That is a three-dimensional piece that if you felt it, you would feel that fuzzy substance that was made out of. That would be a tactile experience. Or just any actual texture. If you feel the surface of a table, it's smooth. If you feel the tread on a tire, it's bumpy. That's tactile. That's actual texture. Implied texture is the illusion of the experience. So many of the works we've looked at that are paintings, you could run your hand across it, like he said on that Chuck Close painting of the self-portrait, and while you see little stubbles on his face, it's going to feel smooth because it's just a painting. It's just a smooth painted painting. It's illusionary that it looks like it's stubble on someone's face or hair. And then, as we said, pattern is any decorative, repeated motif. Motif is just like a little symbol or a shape or something like that that's been repeated, a design. So here's a couple of examples of texture. The first one, the painting, you can look at the things within that painting and think about how they would feel if you could actually touch them. The bowl, it's painted so realistically, so naturalistically, that you could almost imagine how these things would feel in real life. The peach and how a peach feels on the surface, like kind of fuzzy, smooth, fuzzy, soft. The bowl would feel like cold and smooth, like the ceramic that it's made out of, very smooth and shiny. The fabric, you can tell what the fabric texture of the laying on the table would feel like. So those are what we would call implied textures because you can't feel them. They just look that way, right? The second example is a sculpture by Brancusi that you can see the texture. So the bottom and the base of it is wooden. It looks kind of rough. It looks a little bumpy. It looks kind of like wood would feel. And you could actually feel that. You'd probably be thrown out of the art museum, but you could, if you were allowed to, you could feel that actual texture of that wooden base. And the top of it, made out of metal, very smooth, shiny, just very, very slick. You could feel that, and it would feel how it looks, right? So that's an example of actual texture. Makes sense. This painting by Samuel Faso is titled The Chief. He liked to do interesting works of art that are kind of reflective of African American culture and heritage, rooting clear back to African culture, and the patterns and things sort of reflect that. So this is an example of using pattern that creates a visual texture. I'm going to say visual texture. Do you see that? If I felt the floor, there's just tons of patterns in this. So look at the floor. There's a couple different patterns you can see there. If I felt that, though, I'm not going to feel those individual shapes and designs. It's going to feel smooth or feel like one texture, but it creates a visual texture. And the back thing with the mirrors on it, that real bumpy this right here, that is definitely a visual texture. It feels like it looks like it feels bumpy, but it's just a pattern. So hopefully that kind of makes that understandable. Now for our final, I keep saying the final, it's still not the final. Almost the final element of art is space. So make sure you get this one down clearly in your notes. Space interacts with other visual elements and helps give them definition. There exists both negative and positive space. Just like there was negative and positive shapes, there are negative and positive shapes, or spaces as well. Three-dimensional space has height, width, and depth. So here will be an example. It's the interior of the Guggenheim Museum, and you can see how this design of this building is really a specific space. The artist, the designer, the architect has really thought about how to create this space to be interesting, to have some of these kind of odd forms that are walls, lots of curves. And then it's kind of interesting right here, you can see a little drawing of his plan for that museum. So that's just an example of an interior space that takes up three-dimensional space. Two-dimensional space has only height and width. So three-dimensional has height, width, and depth. Two-dimensional has just height and width. There exists the picture plane. The picture plane, I've used that term several times, I don't know if you've noticed, is the piece of paper or canvas or thing that you're working on. So when you have, just picture a piece of paper, blank piece of paper. When you have a picture plane like that, the illusion of the negative or the ground and the positive is the figure of that space. So this is, as you can see, very much overlapping with shapes. Often when I'm teaching figure and ground and positive and negative, I refer to them as, I kind of mix them together and I say positive space shapes and negative space shapes. The positive space shapes would be the ground. And just putting it all together, because it really does kind of all go together. So while it's a shape, it is also a space. And then I say negative space shape. While it's a shape, and it's the background, it's still a space as well. Let me see if I can click to an image to talk about positive space shape and negative space shape. So, like in this one where we were talking about warm colors, the object itself, right, the sculpture itself, we know is called the figure or the positive shape. And so, you know, all of this is the figure, the positive space, all of this, the things that we see. Positive space, it's also a shape. We can draw the shape of the thing. It's also the figure. Then we have the background, which in this case is just like the white wall, the thing that's not the artwork. So in this case, we would have negative space. It's also a shape, and it's also titled the ground. So like even this little place here, we would call, you could think of it as the background, the negative space, the negative shape. It's all those things at once. This area here is negative space. It's part of the background. Okay, so then see if I can. I was going to see if I can find another non-sculptural. Okay, let's look at this guy. So we've talked about this one as the positive space is positive space. The new thing we're talking about, space, is him, right? So he is the positive space. He is also the figure. He is also the positive shape. So all those things at once. This area back here, all of this stuff back here, is the background, or we call that the ground, figure ground. The negative space, all this around the positive space is the negative space. And we could also think of it as the negative shape. So hopefully you're getting a grasp on that. The elements overlap, and they sometimes are referring to the same thing. So back to the slide. That's just explaining in two-dimensional space. We have height and width, but we have a picture plane, and we can divide it between the negative and the positive space. Another definition is implied space. Implied space is where we want, again, on a piece of paper, the artist is trying to create the illusion that it's taking up space, that it goes back in space. And so there's some really pretty simple things you can do in creating an illusion like this. And one thing is just putting overlapping. Purposefully making one thing overlap another implies that one thing is behind another. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And then the other thing is creating a foreground, middle ground, and background. So let's just look at this 18th century Indian painting that uses some of these techniques. Now, you might look at this and think, oh, that does not look very realistic, or that does not look like it's really, it's got some issues, right, as to why it doesn't feel like real life. But that's beside the point. What we do want to show with this one is that you can very clearly see that when you look at this, we talk about reading a painting. When you look at this, you see that everything right here is closest to us. No one told you that until I just did. But when you looked at it, you could assume that this elephant is closer to us than this elephant and then this horse. We know that this artist is trying to make us know that this is closest. There's a few reasons how he's doing that. When you move up the piece of paper, the picture plane, we know that that is the same as going back in space. Why do we know that? Because when we look out a window at a landscape, we can see that the things lower down are closer to us, and as they go up, as our eyes move up, they're going back towards the horizon line to the sky, things way off in the distance. That's just how vision works. That's just how physics works. So when you render that on a piece of paper, the things that are from this line and down, we would call that the foreground, the things closest to us. We just know that. And then this area in the middle is typically called the middle ground, and those are generally things that are in the middle range, further back. And then we have the background. Now in this case, this building kind of fits into the background, it looks like. And these soldiers back here and this horse, those would kind of be background area. These two lines that I just did to divide it into three pieces vary picture by picture. It's not always the same. It's not easy to read in every single work of art. But when an artist is trying to depict space realistically, this is just known. It goes back in space as you move up the piece of paper. Now, a couple of things that the artist is doing, well, that was one thing. This person was purposefully placed here This person purposely placed here, he did that intending us to read it like he's further back. So that's position. But then overlap is a very simple thing, as I said, that like these horses, these elephants and the horses are doing, and these soldiers over here are doing. This elephant covers up part of this one, doesn't it? This elephant covers up part of this one, and so on. This soldier is positioned, first of all, lower on the piece of paper, so that's position, but he's overlapping a little bit of this guy. And when we see that, we read that in our just human intellect as to mean that one thing is in front of the other, one thing is closer to us than the other. If you look at where their feet are, speaking of position again, his are planted there, his are planted there. Do you see what's happening? Look where my blue lines are. They're moving up the piece of paper. And that is how we know these soldiers are going back in space. These people's feet down here are lower than where these people's feet are. So we know this group of people is further back in space than this. So those are examples of how you use position and overlap. Very simple, not difficult or even hard to do, but it does create that illusion of space. So implied space is when you use overlapping in position, like I just described, foreground, middle ground, background. Now, illusionistic space includes foreshortening, linear, isometric, and atmospheric perspective. So this is more like where you're really trying to create the illusion, like you're really visually drawing it out, creating it this way so that it's using these technical ways to create art to create the illusion of space, of deep space. So let's look at examples of that. This is the basic principle of linear perspective, which I was describing to you when we were talking back about line. And one of the things it said you can do with line is create the illusion of going back in space. And so this is how you do that. So this is using line, to the element of line, to create the element of space. This technique was not always known in the Italian Renaissance time period. Really, artists made great strides towards figuring out 1-point perspective, 2-point perspective, and then they put it in many of their works of art. If you look at Renaissance art, there's almost always some form of architecture or buildings inserted in, because it's like they just love doing it. They could see how it really visually made things look like it goes back in space. And really, it's just mathematical laws that you're using. Again, physics, how the world is designed, how God made it, so that our eyes can see space like this and use this technique of perspective. It basically, I'm not going to go into it or make you do it, but it essentially is on this idea that there's a horizon line. That represents your eye level. And then you put a vanishing point on the horizon line. That's where all the lines in the image are going to converge back to. And then anything you draw on within this picture, the edges of it are going to angle back towards the vanishing point. As you can see, all these lines, unless they are horizontal lines, they're going to actually converge back to the vanishing point. So, like this box that they drew in the front, they drew the back edge of it, or you can think of it as a rug, in the front edge of it, but the sides are not going to be vertical lines. They're going to be angling diagonals back towards the vanishing point. So here's 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective. Same concept. Horizon line, this is 1-point perspective here, but a more complicated drawing. Horizon line is eye level. Horizon line is eye level. These are two little separate drawings, so don't think it's one picture. You can start by drawing a box. You can practice this on your own and see if you can do it. Draw a box, any shape, like that. And then from the top corners, it's going to angle back towards this vanishing point. And then you can draw a line on the back, and that represents the back edge of the box. And boom, you have a box in correct perspective. Looks like it's going back in space. Same thing with 2-point. The big difference here is you don't draw the front side of a box, you draw the front corner of a box. And then from the bottom of that line, you go to this vanishing point. From this one, you go to this vanishing point, hence the name 2-point perspective. And then from the top of that line, you draw to the vanishing point, top of the line to the vanishing point. And then you'll chop off your box with some vertical lines on either side. And then where they crisscross, going towards the vanishing point, creates the top of the box. And then you would erase all these dotted lines that they put are what you would erase. And it creates correct perspective. So that is creating the illusion of space, but using line to do that. And in this particular one, which is probably seen it before, Da Vinci's The Last Supper, where is the vanishing point? Can you tell? Look at the room. Look at where these lines converge to. Look at these ceiling tiles where they converge to. They converge to Jesus' head. So you have all the disciples on either side of the table. You have Jesus right in the center, and we could talk about in this one what we've talked about in the other ones, some directional cues using line, right? When you use perspective in this case and you put something important right at the vanishing point, your eyes, the viewer's eyes, are going to go directly to that. So it's emphasizing Jesus as well. That's kind of the directional thing. Look at this guy's arm. It's kind of like pointing that way. Several people are looking at him. So that's what we talked about with implied line for directional cues to put the emphasis on Jesus. And I put this little picture in here because it's interesting. The Last Supper is a fresco, which means that it was painted right into wet plaster on the wall. And when that happens, they start to decay. They start to, over hundreds of years, as you can see, this was made in 1495. It's very, very old. They start to fall apart, basically. The plaster chips off, and so you lose the painting. And so some artists, painstakingly, like this lady, are restoring artists, and they go back and they do it exactly as he did, and they mix up the plaster, and they do tiny little areas at a time to restore it as perfectly accurately as possible to how Da Vinci painted it. Which is kind of an interesting side note. Okay, continuing with illusionistic. So we talked about, with illusionistic space, we talked about 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective. But there's a couple of other things you can do. Foreshortening is the effect of a linear perspective when applied to objects and human forms within a work of art. So we talked about buildings and structures, right? Boxes, using linear perspective. But take a look at this one. This one is an example of foreshortening, but we're putting a human form into that linear perspective format. So in this room, you can look at a few things and maybe tell where the vanishing point might be. It's kind of high up. This one, you can see where this line is angling back to. This line is angling back to. So maybe the vanishing point is somewhere in here. Our eye level in this picture is probably somewhere in here. And so here you have this guy on the floor. Look, he's fitting into a piece of area that would work with that linear perspective. But he's a human. So when you're drawing a human, it's tricky. You might look at this and say, wow, that looks fine. I don't see that it's all that tricky. But look at how, since he's laying down like this, look at how much distance is right here for his whole chest. If he were standing upright, his chest from like stomach to neck would be much longer. This is a tiny amount of space right there. Do you see? Even like his leg right here, it looks fine to us, but if you really were to look at the actual length of that, compared to him if he was standing up, this space, this length is not very long in regard to a whole entire figure. If he was standing up, if we could go and make it stand for upright, that length would probably be more like this. So hopefully you're catching on to what I'm saying. Like the length from knee to hip would be more like that. So this is called foreshortening, where you have to really, it takes a lot of artistic skill, because our human minds want to draw how we think a leg should look, not how it's actually looking when it's in a weird perspective like this. So know that Hans Grein, The Groom and the Witch, this painting, or this, actually it's a etching, I believe, is an example of foreshortening. That's why it's underlined. It's probably going to be asked on a test. So you want to make sure you know that that particular work of art, sketch it out if you need to, describe it if you need to, is an example of foreshortening. And I said this already. Actually, the horse is in foreshortening too. Do you see that? Think how that horse size and how it would look different if we were seeing him straight on from the side. We're seeing him at a funny angle. So his stomach length is a very short distance in this picture. But if he were to go ahead and turn sideways fully, it would be much longer. That's foreshortening. And I think I've said it, it's hard to do. It's a tricky way to draw. The other type was atmospheric perspective. So we've done 3 things now. We've done we have done implied space, and now we're doing illusionistic space. And within illusionistic space, we're talking about foreshortening and atmospheric perspective. And also we're talking about one-point perspective. Technical ways to draw, to paint, to make it look like it's taking up space. Atmospheric perspective is this. As objects recede into the distance, they become paler, bluer, and less distinct. So here's an example of that happening. John Frederick Kinsick, Lake George, in 1869. So things up here in the front, these will be in the foreground, are sharper, clearer. We can see the individual blades of grass. We can see details in the rocks. As we go back in space, things start to get a little fuzzier. Look at these trees back here in comparison to these trees even. These are like middle ground trees, but we've gone back further here into the distance and they're fuzzier. We lose clarity as we go back in space. And then these look how dark and some texture we see on this little mountain thing or hill. And then look how that changes as we go to this next section back of hill. They purposely made it grayer, kind of bluer, fuzzier, less detail. And that is to create that illusion of deep space. Then you have the sky, which is a whole other thing that pulls things back in space. So atmospheric perspective is where you're really looking at how the atmosphere affects things. And this is a real, true thing that you can see when you go to a place where you can see way off into the distance, really anywhere. Mountains, you can see it really well. But even on a flat plane, if you were looking out way into the distance, you're going to see like the Up close, you see detail. Colors are brighter, more intense, and as they go back into the distance, they get grayer, fuzzier. It's just a natural way that things look. So here again is another type of perspective. Now, this is under the category still of illusionistic. And we talked about 1-point perspective and 2-point perspective, and those are, like I said, they were discovered during the Italian Renaissance, actually due to the invention of a very crude and primitive camera, the camera obscura. Once that they could see an image of something, they could actually see how lines worked. They could understand, oh, things are converging as they go back in space. The lines appear to be coming together. Artists just didn't understand that really prior to that discovery in the 1400s. So, this is kind of what perspective looked like before the discovery of 1-point perspective or 2-point perspective, linear perspective, I should say. Isometric perspective does not depict 3D space accurately. They could see, artists of this time period before the Renaissance could see that things looked three-dimensional, like you could see the top of something like this, and the sides of it. So they had the right idea that walls and buildings and things were going back in space, but they just didn't understand that these 3 lines, this one, and this one, should be converging to one dot to make it accurate. They just didn't understand that. And so what you get when you just kind of randomly draw lines back in space is a cube that does not look accurate. It looks 3D, but it's not quite right. The angles feel off. And like if you're drawing a rectangle receding in space, like if this were a rug on the floor, they could see that the sides were angled going somewhere, but they didn't quite understand that there should have been one point where they would actually eventually converge to. If the lines went on forever, they would actually converge to that dot. So they weren't understanding it very well. And the result was paintings that looked a lot like this. This would be, not this particular painting, this is obviously a Middle Eastern painting, but artwork from such as the Middle Ages oftentimes would look this way. We'll study this stuff later on in the year. The Middle Ages was very much, they didn't understand perspective. So the artwork looks kind of like this, or something like this. So you do get a sense of something going back in space, right? You can see this is the foreground, middle ground, background. The real problems come into like this wall right here. This is what I was just saying about a rectangle and the lines just go out to the side, but it doesn't really make sense in perspective. Even this chair that he's sitting on, they could see that to draw it, you want to be able to draw the side of the chair and make it look like it's going back, but because it's drawn inaccurately according to the laws of linear perspective, it just feels kind of weird. It feels kind of off. And this is common too, like this whole pink area just kind of represents a big chunk of land, and then they just sort of plop these things down on that land. So anyway, it's kind of interesting to see the radical change that the discovery of 1 and 2 point perspective had on art. Middle Age art versus the Renaissance time, which is just a couple hundred years difference. It's really not very much difference. And in fact, this is 1558, I see, and I don't know the exact date of the Camera Obscura off the top of my head, but the Italian Renaissance was a little in the foreground, in the beginning of perspective and art knowledge. So this just may not have been to this region yet, like the knowledge of how to create art that way. Or this could just be a culturally a culturally made work of art, that's how they wanted their art to look. They may have had the knowledge of drawing more realistically, and they chose not to. Clearly, it's very stylized, right? Remember, stylized means like a really specific way of drawing based on a culture or a region. And so it definitely fits in with a stylized category as well. And now for our final element, time and motion. So this one is one that's often not included in a lot of art school discussion or textbooks. It has been added, and it's recognized only in recent times, 20th and 21st centuries. There's more thought and emphasis placed on the nature of time in our modern world. I think you can think about that and understand it. Like, time, motion, with the invention of social media, with all the video techniques that are out there, it's just become a more important part of our modern world than it used to be. So this has now become an element. This is something that artists can use and create an entire work of art just based on motion, time, video. Kinetic art, which is there on your screen. Kinetic art is art that actually moves. So I have one example. I'll let you copy that down first. Make sure you remember that this element has just become recognized in the 20th and 21st centuries. So here is my example for you to see. I don't know. Let's see if this is still available online for us to watch. This is called Dervish, and it is, what you're seeing here is like inside of an art gallery. It's kind of like an installation because it is taking up a space, and you have a whole room, and this is just video projected onto the walls of these trees that she videotaped from long periods of time, like as they go through the different seasons. So some of them are fall, spring, winter. You can see all the different, the way the tree changes over time. So there's the time element. Then you have movement, obviously. They are like spinning. Somehow she took the videos, I guess, from an angle where she could like create the spinning effect of the tree. A dervish is someone who spins, and so that is how that connection's made between the tree spinning. It kind of has like this swirling out effect. X out of that. Okay. So this Jennifer Steinkamp, and it's titled Dervish, 2004. Is a pretty good example, actually, of time, both the seasonal change of the tree over time and the movement of it. It also shows you a good example of an installation where it's taking up a space. And I believe that is our last element. So this was a longer lecture. I know it was almost the full amount of time for a class period. So there will be one more video on, like I said, the principles of design, which is then taking these elements and using them together to create certain design characteristics. And we'll discuss that next time. And then there will be a quiz test over lessons 4 and 5 together. So, hope you've enjoyed the lecture, and see you soon.